So hi everyone, thanks for joining. We'll just let one or two others join through Zoom and then we'll get going. Um, while we do that, I'll just give a little bit of background. So my name's Tim Crabtree and I'll be chairing the session. And I'm joined by Laura Tiley from This Living Place, who's organised all the webinars and done all the hard work. So I'm chair of Dorset Community Energy and I work for Wessex Community Assets. And we have some funding from the Community Energy Fund via the Southwest Net Zero Hub to look at the feasibility of a retrofit service for Dorset. So that's the kind of background to this seminar, this webinar. So I'll just share my screen and I'll get going just because this is the sort of background and I want to give as much time as possible to Tom and Steph. Okay, so just very briefly then, Dorset Community Energy, we're a community benefit society, been going since 2013. At the moment, we mostly focus on putting PV onto community buildings, hospitals, and schools. We've raised about 1.5 million to do that. We do that through share offers. Sorry, my screen is frozen. Yeah, so we do that through share offers. We're developing a new portfolio at the moment. But we also are looking at whether we can provide services around retrofit as well. And we work with Wessex Community Assets, which is also a community benefit society, which mainly focuses on community-led housing. And again, most of that has been new build, but over the last couple of years, we've increasingly looked at retrofit also as something that we get involved in. The project has a number of partners, as you can see, and we're also working with People Powered Retrofit up in Manchester, who are providing us with their assessment tool that we use for retrofit assessment. So when we first of all sort of proposed exploring a retrofit service, these were the sort of elements that we were looking at. And we were also particularly interested in this issue of zero carbon materials. How do you do retrofit without using materials that are full of carbon? And also we're very interested in kind of local sourcing. So the last 4 or 5 years, we have been developing a partnership called Raise the Roof with organizations like Assemble and University of Plymouth. And it's basically to say, how do we link local regenerative agriculture and forestry with sustainable and affordable housing, both new build and retrofit? And what's the gap? How do we put in place the local processing and manufacturing infrastructure for that? So we've been inspired by sort of various people like Material Cultures who've been using hemp. Here locally, we have a heritage of flax and hemp. And so the last 3 years, we've been working with local farmers to grow hemp and also flax. And then we've been working with the University of Plymouth to say, how do we use these materials, clay, hemp, flax, timber, in both construction and in retrofit. And we're particularly interested in this, how do you combine together materials? And yeah, can this be used both for new build construction and for retrofit? And we have a couple of projects at the moment that we're looking at. One is a sort of multi-occupancy building currently empty in Bridport, and the other one is a house that's just been compulsory purchased by Dorset Council, and we're hoping to have that transferred to us to do a retrofit project on. And in all of this, we're asking the question, how do we do that with bio-based natural materials? And in particular, how can we use materials that are sourced locally? So that's the kind of background for the webinar. And I'll stop sharing. And I've got have great pleasure in inviting Stephanie Crombie and Tom Graham to join the webinar and share their experience. So I got to know them via the Architects Climate Action Network. If you go on that website, there's a whole series of really good webinars on natural materials, the use of natural materials in construction and retrofit. But we've got a great opportunity this evening to hear directly from Steph and from Tom of their own take on natural materials in retrofit. So I'll pass over first of all to Stephanie. So Stephanie's an architect who works with a practice called Supernatural Studio, which is based in Dorset, but also works in London. And Tom is a natural builder who mainly works out of Somerset, but could also work in Dorset as well, we hope. So I shall pass over to you both. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim, for that introduction. And yeah, I think you could do a webinar on all of the interesting things you're doing as part of your initiatives. So right, so Tom and I have been asked to speak about sourcing materials from our local landscape, and this is exploring how Dorset's land and natural resources could support retrofitting through locally sourced materials, fostering connections with the landscape and empowering communities. And we are kind of focusing that through the lens of our experience and expertise, which is through ACAN and the Natural Materials Group, and then our backgrounds in kind of architecture and construction. And I will pass over to Tom. Did you want to say anything about?
I know, I mean, other than to introduce myself, I thought you were going to introduce yourself, but should I
No, it was just we were going to talk about the fact that we, in terms of like sourcing our local landscape, it's not like we just want to highlight at the beginning that we're not.
Yeah. No, so absolutely, and so we're not the experts in growing our buildings, growing materials for our buildings, but we're massive advocates for it. So but yeah, we're going to talk about through our lens and experience of natural materials, as Steph says.
Yeah, and then we've got a big Q&A at the end.
Caveat.
Yeah, we've got a big Q&A at the end, so we can run through that. So Tim's already done introductions, but essentially I am an architect by training, and we advocate for natural materials as much as we possibly can through our practice. And then Tom.
Yeah, so I'm studied architecture, but jumped ship sort of after my sort of part 2 to do a sort of more hands-on discipline in the shape of furniture and joinery. So that's on the left of the screen there. Some of that's the sort of thing that I was getting up to before buying an old stone property in Frome, which I've had the opportunity to sort of retrofit. And so from the background working with the furniture kind of brought me, you know, I was working at the coalface of material and working it and disposing of its waste, and that kind of led me down a path of sort of massive sort of advocacy for natural materials, and sort of almost the opposite as well. It often led to materials by distaste, disgust even of non-natural materials that we're so surrounded by. So yeah, I kind of came full circle from sort of architecture through furniture back to working with buildings and particularly retrofit of traditional buildings with natural materials.
Cool. So we are members of the Architects Climate Action Network, also known as ACAN, which is a collective of built environment professionals who advocate for rapid and a just transition to a zero carbon future. Through campaigns, education, and collaboration, ACAN aiming to challenge industry norms and push for a systemic change in policy practice and also material sourcing. These are the 3 aims, kind of core aims of ACAN, which is decarbonise now, ecological regeneration, and cultural transformation. And if you want to find out out more, there is a wealth of information on the website below.
Yeah. Okay. So and so ACAN is sort of divided up into these 9 groups that you see at the top right of your screen there, and it's sort of independently, without, there's a very sort of flat sort of democratic structure to the organization, and independently these groups have created various resources, from the circular economy group's design guide, focusing on retrofit, the climate emergency conservation area toolkit. These are actual documents that, or sort of, you know, sort of campaigning documents that have been put together by the groups, and then our natural materials group. One of our sort of big outputs that we do sort of regularly is these webinars. So having experts talking about well, I think Steph's going to lead on to it here, but talking about well, yeah, so some of the things you might see here: building with stone, and you know, how to design ground floors, specific yeah, so techniques or the, you know, how-tos with the use of natural materials. So Steph,
yeah, we've got a part of the website dedicated to natural materials, which is the working group that Tom and I kind of coordinate for. And then yeah, our biggest resources, as Tom said, are the webinar series that we've got. I think there's about 20 videos on there now. And then we've also got, which is soon to be released in the next couple of weeks, a detail library for how to detail different natural material build-ups, which include things from hemp to stone to rammed earth to yeah, wood fibre, and sort of it's kind of growing resource. We've got a very chatty WhatsApp group, and we're just trying to bring the kind of knowledge base into this sort of more formalized forum where we can share our knowledge, because that's really what ACAN is about.
Yeah.
Go on, Tom.
Yeah, no, so as I say, this is, so yeah, what we're hoping to talk about now is, so basically what you see in front of you, the benefits of natural materials, and, you know, specifically to retrofit here. And then we want to look at a certain kind of dichotomy that has come up in our conversations that I think is particularly interesting, which is this kind of discussion of building with products. Are we building with products, or are we building with materials? And then this has an impact on sort of how we you know, on whether we're using local, you know, locally you know, sourced stuff, or actually more globally sourced. So where we're going to source materials, where around Dorset, and a few example projects, hopefully followed by Q&A. So yeah, stick your questions in the chat, I believe.
So we're going to start off with kind of, I guess, for those who don't use natural materials or aren't kind of accustomed to them, sort of a bit more high level natural materials before going into a bit more detail. So it's very hard to gauge on these webinars how much knowledge people come with already, but just to give you kind of high level overview, there's lots of reasons why we like natural materials. We sort of pinned it down to about 10, which we'll just talk through really quickly. So firstly, natural materials, so for example, lime plaster, timber, hempcrete and clay, absorb and release moisture, preventing condensation and damp issues, which are common with synthetic barriers. This is one of my favourite graphics from Cedar, from their Sustainable Renovation Guide, and it just illustrates your opportunities or kind of your challenges of retrofitting. So this is an internal wall insulation example. On the left, you've got a synthetic internal wall insulation, and on the right, you've got a natural wall insulation. So it's really important detailing and not trapping moisture, particularly in kind of historic buildings where you would have had vapor permeable walls, that you have that you don't trap that moisture sort of within, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but like within the structure of the walls, because this impacts various kind of elements within the construction that really need to be kind of protected. And natural materials sort of work in tandem with existing kind of heritage materials, just to give you a much more robust solution to detailing and insulating new buildings and retrofit buildings as well.
Yeah, and you know, very much allied to that is improved indoor air quality. So often part of retrofit is actually reducing the loss of our unwanted hair, making our buildings more airtight. And this can easily sort of like reduce internal air quality. And many man-made materials are, often petrochemical, are they're off-gassing VOCs, and creating a toxic cocktail, within our buildings. And so natural materials are non-toxic, and can often actually help create an indoor, a sort of healthier indoor environments through that sort of moisture buffering that Steph was sort of alluding to.
Sorry.
That's it.
Okay, a kind of obvious one is lower embodied carbon. So materials like wool and cork and straw also have significantly lower carbon emissions compared to concrete, steel, and plastics, and all kind of XPS and EPS insulation. So just, I mean, this diagram very generously offers negative carbon emissions to these kind of natural materials, which is slightly contentious in that it should typically be reported separately, but it is thinking about kind of locking away carbon emissions. The kind of advantages of using natural materials, you can lock away those carbon emissions within your building, and they're also kind of inherently low carbon to start with as well, particularly when they are local, although that's a challenge in itself.
Yeah, so with thermal performance, whilst you might achieve on paper better U values with synthetic insulations, often particularly in the example of summertime overheating, the sort of the extra mass you would have with natural insulations, it does a fantastic job of again regulating the temperature, sort of the sort of diurnal variation, which kind of absorbs heat during the day, re-releasing at night, and preventing that kind of incredibly overheated summer attic that has 150 mil of Celotex up there, so super insulated and then entirely uninhabitable. Natural materials are fantastic at creating. Can be fantastic at creating really well balanced thermal environments.
The other thing is acoustic comfort. So the natural materials often provide excellent sound insulation, and this is largely to do with their kind of structural build-up. So this enhances acoustic comfort in homes without relying on synthetic acoustic boards or foam insulation. These are just a couple of examples from taken from a website called Materials 2050, which, if you're interested in kind of other innovative and interesting materials out there, they've got a great database, and it has and I don't think these are kind of verified, so just take them with a little pinch of salt, but carbon emissions, recycled content, water use, and then manufacturing location with associated EPDs sometimes for different materials. So a useful resource.
Yeah, so I mean, very often the materials that are available locally are less processed, and therefore by using locally sourced natural materials, you're inherently supporting a local economy and the shorter sort of supply chains that come with that, and locking in money into local economies. So that can go hand in hand with natural materials.
Yeah, so Tim can probably speak more to this, but it's like supporting local farmers, sawmills, quarries, and then craft people as well. There's loads of people within that sort of supply chain that can benefit from using local natural materials. This is one of my favorite slides. So I really like the durability and repairability of natural materials. These are obviously timber beams that have been spliced together where they've been damaged. It looks like fire in a couple of cases, but to kind of general use. And what's really lovely about working with kind of natural materials in this way is that they can be much more long lasting, and they're really easy to repair, unlike cement-based materials or composites, for example, that can degrade and essentially require kind of full replacement.
Yeah, and then another thing that is really important to think about is, and this is has been very personal for me, is like what happens to our materials at end of life. And so so working with both natural and non-natural materials in throughout sort of my career, you become very aware of the question of what happens to this material at end of life when you're tasked with getting rid of stuff. And yeah, we need to just be very conscious of the impact of our materials at end of life. What does that mean? Can this stuff be reused, or can it be returned to the soil, or is it conversely having a persistent negative impact for every time we use materials?
I guess in relationship to that, there's soil health and regeneration. So regenerative forestry is a real kind of active improvement of soil health, promoting biodiversity, reducing erosion, enhancing soil sequestration. And there are specific crops that can be really, really good at this. These are some examples of kind of hemp. So unlike extractive industries that can often be seen as depleting natural resources, there are ways in which I guess using natural materials in construction can actually be regenerative in that sense.
Yeah, and then I guess finally on this sort of long list of wonderful things about natural materials is that actually they can lend a real aesthetic and cultural value as materials that weather and age and are part of our landscape and our buildings built of materials of the earth, of the land, develop a greater connection between themselves and the land, and have historically thus led to the reason that bits of Dorset look like that bit of Dorset, and and Wiltshire looks like Wiltshire, and Somerset looks like Somerset, or but far more locally than that. And so and I think that aesthetic and cultural value has yeah, it's gaining traction certainly amongst certain people, and I think it's a really important thing to cling a hold of.
So I will say that there are some challenges with these natural materials, which we will come on to later, but we thought we'd start with all the bits that we like about them.
Yeah.
So on to something that popped up when we were talking about what we were going to discuss during this webinar, is this concept of product versus material, and then also sort of global versus local. We, as a natural materials group, and Tom and I very specifically, loved this book by Barnabas Calder that came out in 2021, and if you haven't read it yet, I can not recommend it enough. It's called Architecture from Prehistory to Climate Emergency, and essentially posits that the evolution of architectural styles and structures is deeply intertwined with the availability of energy resources, encapsulated in the idea that form follows energy. So a single barrel of oil is approximately 1,700 kilowatt hours of energy, and considering that average human manual labour is about 0.6, it's about one person is about over 7.5 years is the same as a barrel of oil. So it's kind of examining modern architecture's reliance on fossil fuels and highlighting that buildings and their operations account for about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we are to move into a future that doesn't rely on fossil fuels so much, what does that architecture look like? And I think that's something that yeah, Tom and I are really kind of engaged with, kind of moving forwards, particularly through ACAN and also our own work.
Yeah. I mean, and the book is just full of what I think are absolutely incredible nuggets. And so with that energy thinking, so historically, pre-industrial revolution, if you look at buildings built before the Industrial Revolution, no buildings were built with materials from further than 10 miles from around that, a 10-mile radius around that property, because it was just too hard to get those materials. Come the Victorian era, you began to get this kind of fascinating thing where trains came around and people were could move a brick from one end side. You could make bricks, and you could make bricks in like hitherto unknown proportions, but you could shift a brick from the northwest to London and a brick from London to the northwest, and we started this process of sort of having buildings that could look however we chose, and kind of separating ourselves from the materials of our landscape, from buildings that looked very much of a place. And this is one of the images. Actually, yeah, it features in the book, but it also features in Barnabas's talk that he gave for the ACAN Natural Materials group, which is that webinar is on our on our YouTube channel, and I'd highly recommend it. But yeah, so this image was you can see the haystacks of the countryside crying as the bricks are fired out like sort of missiles from gunfire from the ever expanding city. So there's always been this kind of reaction to the growth, and so this is what's 1829, this image, but I think we're having our own version of that sort of 200 years or so later.
So when we talk about this kind of products versus materials, this is kind of how we're sort of framing it, and I think there's like very much pros and cons of both, and we thought it would be quite interesting just to have a chat between me and Tom about I guess what the advantages of each are and how we would kind of perceive using them. But Tom, you want to talk about sort of the concept?
Yeah. No, I just think it's I mean, it was an idea that came up in conversation, multiple times between a few people, that about the way we think about our buildings, and very often we're led to in the 21st century in construction, we're led to think of the way we build our buildings as a series of products that are connected to each other and sit on top of each other, and so on and so forth. And yet, when we look at our historic buildings, they're very much made not of products but of materials. And of course, products are made of materials, but I feel like there is a benefit to thinking more about material, behavior of material, and then how we can work that around the material resources that are available to us, and thinking sort of materially before we think about what's provided to us as products.
Yeah. And I think it's, I guess, as an architect, I kind of, there's loads of benefit. I find, I'm going to talk about products, because we've had this conversation kind of backwards and forwards loads very recently, and there's huge advantages to both. And it's kind of, is it Beth Chatto who has the garden philosophy of like right plant, right place? And in some ways it's the same thing with kind of building materials. It's the right building material and we're in the right place. But I guess in terms of products, I can see there's lots of benefits in the sense of, I mean, guess what we're talking about is process, and with process comes consistency. So things that are engineered for reliable strength, fire resistance, insulation qualities, for example, we can then use those to satisfy compliance, which we have to do as part of building regulations, insurance requirements, warranty standards, for example. Natural materials can be particularly hard to certify, which can add complexity to the approval process. So I can see the value in the kind of product side of things from that side. And then I guess practicality as well. So pre-cut insulation boards, engineered timber panels, prefabricated elements can often be kind of quicker and easier to install. So one example is kind of hemp block, and we had this discussion about cast in situ hemp and also hemp blocks. Whereas actually cast in situ hemp, you don't get the kind of thermal ridging through the mortar. It's a bit cheaper. However, you've got to do the formwork, and also you're applying a kind of wet trade on site, and sometimes dry trades, you know, that can be easily laid. We did a hempcrete extension, and we asked a bricklayer who'd never worked with hemp before. We told him how to put this hemp blocks up, and absolutely no problem at all, kind of easy. It's a kind of very known quantity for him. And I think it's that kind of applicability to sort of scaling up natural materials that's really important, and you can get through products that can be more challenging to get through materials, in the sense that you don't need kind of specialist skills or potentially more time on site, which isn't always feasible. And I think the other thing that I quite like about products is their supply. So there's a project that Tom's going to talk about later, that one of our friends is doing in Herefordshire, and they took all the clay from the ground and used it on their walls for as kind of earth plaster. We can't do that where we live, in kind of East Dorset. That because all our soil is, I mean, it's about 95% sand, so which you don't want to have on your outside walls. So, you know, there's kind of supply. If we wanted to have kind of lime rendered walls or earth plaster walls, there's a supply issue there as well. We need to think kind of locally. So yeah, it's harder to source those kind of things in large quantities as well, which can make it impractical for bigger developments. So that's my kind of pitch, if you like, for all products.
Yeah, and so I guess I have a sort of the slight counter to that sort of thinking is not that any of that is in any way wrong, but that we can, if we look around us, and we look at the buildings that you know that have stood for hundreds of years and that that many of us are still living in, and the materials that they're made from, we can when these buildings were built, you know, apart from this, for instance, that middle slide with those, I guess, but you know, those are products, but they're also a kind of yeah, so yeah, you know, we can think of them more as like, what do we, you know, what do we need, what role do we need to achieve here, and rather than thinking of a product, it's like what can we source from around us. Yeah, and I don't know, I think, yeah, Steph, do you want to move on from there? Because
no, so I think I guess we're talking about kind of global local product material, and also kind of the time-based element as well. So I get this is again from my favorite document, which is the Cedar Retrofit Guide, and it looks at, I mean, it's, I guess there's a pinch of salt, it's a graphic, but it looks at, I guess, the last century, how the kind of evolution to different building approaches. So essentially early 20th century, as Tom said, most buildings were built from natural materials. They were, however, pretty drafty, but, you know, I guess hand in hand, well ventilated, but they did need to be maintained, and they were incredibly expensive to heat. Well, fuel was quite cheap, but they were incredibly expensive to heat, and they weren't particularly kind of well insulated or comfortable in that sense. And also having a fire in your house isn't great for air quality. Come the 70s, with the advent of synthetic materials, while these offer, I guess, practical advantages, it leads to concerns about indoor air quality, and with the oil crisis, this prompted the gradual introduction of insulation for energy conservation. Late 20th and early 21st century, there's an increased focus on air tightness and insulation with improved energy efficiency standards. This is when the building regulations pretty much come in relation to Part L, but often at the expense of proper ventilation. So modern lifestyles and synthetic materials really exacerbated indoor air quality issues. And now what we're aiming for is a shift towards a more balanced approach that prioritises energy efficiency alongside occupant health by utilising natural materials with proper ventilation. So you can see on the two diagrams on the right, the red line is air tightness, which is essentially what you would, kind of your airtight layer, which is essentially what you need to ensure that you're not losing kind of a lot of heat through your building fabric, which comes with its own challenges in relation to kind of moisture as well, and kind of preserving that building fabric. but you've also got insulation in there to kind of keep your building warm. But with the insulation and air tightness, you also need ventilation, and that's when you're looking at things like MVHRs or decentralized MVHRs to really make which is a mechanical ventilation heat recovery, to really make sure that you're getting really good fresh indoor air with it's also warm. Did you want to bring up your contention with drafty buildings, Tom?
Yeah, no, it was again just another thing that popped up earlier in sort of conversation is just the kind of our understanding of the word drafty, and how it has obviously such negative connotations that these historic buildings that relied on it was when relied on air infiltration to ventilate. This word word drafty has become this very negative thing. But then if you were to think about the fireplace that is required to draw the heat out of it, and you want a good draft on that fireplace to pull that air up and through the chimney, and then air through through the building in and into the building, that's a very positive thing. And there is, I would argue, something to be said for more open buildings and more natural ventilation and a better relationship with perhaps a cooler building with better open air ventilation. I mean, that's potentially a hard argument to make. But it was more just an idea of the notion of that word. So but I feel a bit forced on that on making that point. So Steph, yeah, let's move on.
No, I think basically what we're saying is you need to tackle all of these things together. And drafty buildings were great when there were open fires and you heated things in that way. So just in terms of retrofit, these are, I guess, all products. So take them whichever way you will. But there's lots of different, I guess, natural material products that you can use that are sort of readily available for your natural material projects, if that's something you are looking at. So from the top left, these are cork blocks. This very happy guy, is installing as external wall insulation. You can also do internal wall insulation with these wood fibre boards. This upgraded suspended timber floor with wood fibre insulation as well. And then over one more, this is cellulose insulation, which is loose laid in between timber joists. You've got hemp bats, I believe, which are in kind of internal wall insulation again. And this is hemp bat, or I think it's a hemp bat or a wood fibre in a roof, insulating roof. You can also use wood fibre on the outside, a rigid wood fibre on the outside of this to give you extra insulation. And then on the bottom right, this is a guy using lime plaster, I believe, on external wood fibre insulation. So examples of those natural materials in retrofit in use.
Yeah, and right. Okay, so these pictures are all me doing exactly that. This is my own property, actually. Yeah, so these, when I've sort of spoken about this before, I've often basically been absolutely singing the praises of wood. This is wood fibre insulation in a kind of sandwich around an existing sort of traditional roof. So we had sort of rigid wood fibre on the outer layer on top of the rafters with flexible wood fibre between them, and then again rigid underneath. And the material can be worked in with traditional carpentry tools and traditional carpentry skills, which makes it incredibly accessible. And and much like wood, it's just a pleasure to work with. The dust that does come off is not is not a toxic plastic dust that you're having to sort of breathe in and sweep up, and try not to breathe in that time. Again, and it's but it also allows a kind of an accuracy akin to carpentry and joinery. And so Yes, I mean, you can sort of see perhaps at the bottom right that the dormer there is constructed with wedged shaped profiles of wood fiber that fit precisely to a sort of a faceted shape to create the curved top of a dormer. All of that is just very so it's critical to achieving good thermal performance, avoiding all your gaps, but it's made very possible by the nature of the material and its sort of workability. So so that's what those sort of slides suggest.
And I've touched on this earlier, but we are releasing all the kind of detail build-ups that are we've looked at in relation to different natural materials. So these are kind of retrofit solid floor, wall and hempcrete blocks on the top right. I don't know why I'm going right to left, but I am. And bottom right is timber roofs. That's what Tom's talking about in terms of the different kind of layers of that build-up. Wall and earth blocks, top middle, and then bottom left is a hempcrete wall that's both blocks and sprayed, and then top left is wood fibre with timber cladding.
Yeah, but doesn't work everywhere. Natural materials are not ideal in all scenarios, definitely not. Yeah, so below ground is a difficult situation. And achieving what you might sort of modernist ideas such as flat roofs it's tricky with natural materials, but anywhere where moisture is persistently present presents problems. Solutions come in the shape of design, so avoiding flat roofs, these things that didn't exist for the whole of architecture before the 20th century, more or less. Or materially, so the top left image is foam glass aggregate, so not a natural material. It's foam glass aggregate is recycled glass which has had is heated and a foaming agent blown through it. So it's a high carbon material, but it allows it avoids the use of plastic. So it's not plastic. So it's insulative and it's structural. So you can build off the top of it, but it's not plastic. So you've reduced that kind of impact on soil health, on microplastic pollution, and it also allows you to it stops it's a capillary break, meaning you don't need a damp-proof membrane. Brilliant for retrofit scenarios because you're not pushing moisture towards walls, which will then potentially soak it up. But it's and also it's also very reusable. Again, it's entirely recyclable in its current form, so you can just dig it up and use it again. But yeah, so that's a compromise. So it's a material compromise or design compromise, but those are essential in those situations.
And then we were just going to touch on a couple of places where you might want to source materials from around Dorset that we like to use. So this is Albion Stone in Portland, and if you haven't been, you can have a little tour around their factory if you want to, and it is fascinating. So they obviously, I think they've got 40 years left of stone in this quarry. I mean, the quarry is enormous. It's been going obviously for decades, if not longer. But they've essentially quarried out, you can kind of like walk around under the ground, and where they've quarried out the kind of stone, the specific beds of stone that they want. And then they take them out, extract them, clean them up, cut them, and then make them into various different materials. And one of the products that we have used on a number of projects now is these stone bricks. So essentially you're replacing very high carbon bricks made with clay that's fired at high temperatures with essentially exactly the same thing that's just cut from stone. It's local, it comes from a local environment. It's kind of almost zero processing. You just need to cut it once you get it out of the ground. The thing, it looks beautiful. I think it's got all the kind of different fossil layers, and you can any kind of brick, anyone who's trained as a bricklayer or wants to try bricks can use them. And I mean, you don't have to use them in brick form, you can use them in any form. This is just, I guess, the most accessible form if you are like me, kind of specifying them for projects. And the only thing to note is they are really heavy. So they're slightly more expensive. So just yeah, be aware of that. There does tend to be a kind of a premium on natural materials, largely because they're not used as commonly as other materials, more synthetic ones.
Yeah, and so this is kind of like I mean this is East Brothers Timber, but really it's a shout out to your local timber merchants. So East Brothers are actually up in Wiltshire, but they're around the corner from Dorset. So these guys source homegrown British timber from local foresters, and they mill constructional timber, and sort of joinery timber. And one of the great advantages of using timber from a sort of a mill of this sort, rather than perhaps purely an importer of timber, is that you are able to specify quite, specify the timber for your project to the sizes that you need, which and you work with so in a retrofit scenario, you're working with the timber that was used, the same timber, the same species, that was used in your existing building, and you're replicating perhaps sizes that are non-standard, and you can specify that directly. But these guys, but again, by using local mills who are using locally grown timber, you are just reinforcing centuries old sort of industries, and that remain completely available and viable for sort of traditional for contemporary construction as much as any other sort. But yeah, so East Brothers are great ones, but there are plenty operating at all scales, and
yeah, I guess more products based rather than materials based. Tom and I have both been using Back to Earth, who supply natural building materials, amongst other things as well. They're based in Exeter, so not Dorset exactly, but they supply wood fibre insulation, clay plasters, and lime based materials. And yeah, which is perfect for kind of historic renovations, as well as kind of retrofit projects. Yeah. I will.
And one of the great things about Back to Earth is that they will provide so much information and help and support with specifying your materials, with choosing materials, with helping you choose materials and qualities that are not products that they sell. And this is part of this is often the case with lots of natural material suppliers, because they're still working so hard to get cling on to get a hold on the market, that they will actually offer huge amounts to you as a supplier. And that very much the same with Rose of Jericho. So these guys will they supply traditional paints, pigments, limes, sands, mortars, stone dust, all appropriate to traditional buildings. But not only do they supply it, they will they offer this excellent advice on matching traditional finishes, on matching mortars, renders, and yeah, that's a really important service that often comes with using natural materials, rather than this kind of idea of products and systems, which the entire system needs to be compatible. In this instance, materials need to be compatible, and understanding of materials is critical, and these guys can really help with that.
And then you also need builders who are able to work with natural materials, because they do need slightly different attention, particularly in relation to the detailing. I mean, you can see this roof has got a very nice overhang. So just an example, Half and Puff Construction, I think they were quite active on our WhatsApp in ACAN Natural Materials quite early on. But they focus on materials like straw bales, lime and timber. They're based in Wareham, and they promote kind of low carbon, breathable, energy efficient construction for both new builds and retrofit. And then we were just going to end on a couple of example projects. I'm conscious of time, Tom, because it's 51, so we can maybe just look at these quite quickly.
Whiz through them, yeah. So this is a really interesting one. So this is actually a new build, it's not a retrofit project. So Grain Architecture. This is a really interesting one whereby the superstructure, for all of the reasons Steph mentioned earlier, was built with very much a sort of a systems-based approach, a sort of a Larsen truss with so blown in warm cell insulation, wood fibre on the outside of that, and the pro-passive boards on the inside. Sort of just about make out some of these green boards here. But after that, and that was done by a sort of a traditional, well, not so a construction company who offered that system. But from that point on, it was handed over to to Jana of Grain Architecture for her own property, whereby the internal finishes were dug so the lath and plaster walls. The lath was made from scrap timber. The plaster was clay plaster from clay dug from their garden. They brought in sand, but the bulk of that was their own clay. But the fibre in that plaster was chopped straw from local farmers, and wood fibre waste from the construction. So the sawdust effectively from cutting the wood fibre was mixed into the plaster. So all of these materials hand mixed on site, with lots of volunteers, volunteer help in this case. Yeah, it's sort of a thinking about how do you use what's available, what's around you to build. What is less, was beyond the reach of regulation in this instance. So to some degree. So anyway, so two different things. Steph.
And then, yeah, Tim touched on this earlier, but Margent Farm, also known as Flat House, is a great example of kind of innovative use of hemp, kind of prefab hemp panels. So this is timber frame with hemp infill. And I won't kind of go on this too much, but yeah, really go and find look at it, because it's there's some really interesting and very kind of innovative examples of like hemp boards on the outside, as well as growing all of the material, all of the kind of hemp kind of on site as well. And then I was going to ask Tim to talk about Bridport co-housing here, which we can do, Tim, if you'd like to, or we can kind of move on to Q&A, because I think we've got a couple of slides on where you might want to find resources and suppliers, or we can do the Q&A. What would you like to do?
Move on to your next slide, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was just a really interesting building that was the community. It was the community centre at the heart of it, wasn't it? There was straw, yeah, and then some kind of funky recycled tyre foundations. So yeah, just they will make these slides available at the end. But if you are looking for kind of resources, suppliers, this is a small snapshot of people who are providing products and materials within, I guess, the UK. And then there are other kind of industry bodies that you can also go to and have a look at that are really promoting natural materials in construction. So timber development, Cedar I mentioned before, that's their retrofit guide we're using, the ASBP, SPAB, lots of these are kind of more historic in their reach. So yeah, lots of, and then there's loads of great books and podcasts and interesting things out there. I'll make all this available at the end. And if you'd like to join us at ACAN Natural Materials, this is our plug. We have a WhatsApp group of 800 people, and we're all really chatty. And there's lots of kind of, if you're interested in problems and solutions, and you want to ask a whole host of people what you might want to do with your building, please join us. You can try and copy this link, or I can post it in the chat afterwards. Or you can take a photo of that QR code. And then, yeah, that's it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's wow to be able to sort of pull together everything about natural materials in 40 minutes is a real challenge. So I think you did fantastic, Lee. So thank you very much. And as you said on the ACAN website, there's lots of webinars that go into particular natural materials in a lot of detail, which will be a great follow-up. But I think this has been a fantastic overview of the whole area. So there's a number of questions that have come through. So one of them is about cost, which we sort of touched on a bit when you were talking about materials versus products. And so the question was, if we've got however many houses it is that we need to retrofit, whether it's 8 million or 28 million, there is an issue of cost, obviously, that we need to do that. And the argument has always been, well, we just take the cheapest products. Those products are made from oil, but they save energy, operational energy in use, and let's not worry about the embodied carbon. So what's your kind of take on that? And just to add that to that, I'd say I listened to a really interesting podcast, The Architect's Journal have a podcast, and I was listening to one by somebody from BC Architects who was addressing this issue of scale. And there's also a podcast with Summer Islam from Material Cultures, who was involved in Margent Farm.
Oh yeah, is Summer on the call? Does she want to join?
If she wants to join. But both of those podcasts were addressing this issue of scale. How do you scale up from, that kind of basic level of craft skills and kind of very localized production into the next level that doesn't take you away from the local, but at the same time does scale things up so that things become cheaper? I don't know if you had any views on that, or even if Summer wants to join us.
I can start. So I guess my philosophy is I know the kind of operational embodied carbon piece is an interesting one, and it gets talked about a lot. I think that personally, so we are kind of in a climate emergency now, so we sort of want to use the embodied carbon of your materials is what the carbon that you're putting into the atmosphere right now. So those sorts of things are so if you make something today, then the carbon associated with making that goes into the environment today. Whereas if I use a material to insulate a property, the operational carbon energy that I'm saving is in the future. So there's a kind of future, there's a now carbon cost and a future carbon cost. And in some ways, this is quite hard to explain, but in some ways, the now carbon cost, in my opinion, is more is where the problems are, or where it's got more impact, not where the problems are, but where it's got more impact. Because now every kind of like extra bit of carbon we introduce into the atmosphere now is having a kind of knock-on effect, and you have all the tipping points of climate change, whereas actually saving, creating insulation in like say 10 years time, the grid is decarbonising all the time, and it's one of the great success stories of the UK. And also it's in the future, it's kind of it's 10 years down the line, in the sense of it will aim to cost less to make that, or in terms of carbon to make that product, but also the kind of tipping points are sort of pushed down the line a bit. And I think we kind of have to have a value on carbon now. So in my opinion, embodied carbon today is really important. And then in relation to this kind of supply and demand issue, I think that if you can create a demand for natural materials, then you'll more likely create a supply for them. So there's a reason that America's got like 1 billion cows. It's because a lot of people eat meat. If no one ate meat, there wouldn't be that many cows. And I think it's that kind of supply and demand. And I'm not an economist, so I can't like do that. But I know that the more that we kind of talk about natural materials and the use of natural materials in construction, the more sort of engagement there is on a kind of scale, and that sort of scaling up piece, yeah, kind of has to come if we are going to take retrofitting, particularly with in kind of historic buildings or buildings that need that breathability. You can't always, even if you wanted to, you can't always retrofit with synthetic materials, even if they're cheaper, because quite often they can cause more problems than they're saving. So yeah, it kind of it's that supply and demand, and I think as a designer, that's kind of where I can have the most impact. Tom, did you have anything to add?
Okay, brilliant. We might sort of carry on for another 5 minutes. I know we've sort of slightly gone over, but there are quite a few questions which are really interesting. So if anybody is able to join us, that'd be great, or keep joining us. So there's one here. Which of the most popular retrofit products or materials could be replaced with UK-made natural products or materials?
Go on,
So I
Tom.
guess that's saying that a lot of the materials that are used in retrofit are imported, and what's the scope to replace them?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, timber is an easy one, certainly. There's a default to imported tannalized softwood for construction or timber. Grading is often part of the story here, but it's absolutely overcomable, if that's a word. It's yeah, so that's an easy one. I mean, I guess when people think about retrofit materials, they're often thinking about insulation. We don't have anything like the forests they have in Germany or in Scandinavia. So, you know, wood fiber insulation in this country is always going to be harder, but absolutely not impossible. You don't need to have the biggest forest to still be viable. And so that, you know, that's certainly something that's been looked at.
I think hemp is a good one as
And
well.
hemp, yeah, hemp grows fantastically and has historically grown fantastically in this country. So
And
yeah, there's a bunch of people.
yeah, Indie Nature
Okay.
in
Yeah.
Scotland providing UK grown hemp, I believe. So good.
Yes. Yeah, I think from
Yeah,
Scotland.
for
Okay, another question then. Just quite a straightforward one, hopefully. Can wood fiber external insulation be coated with render directly? Also, can they be clad in wooden panels fixed onto the boards?
we have a garden office where it's clad, and we have a externally clad wood fibre extension that's rendered. So yes, you can do both of those things.
Okay, very good. Gosh, they're coming quick and fast. How are pests managed with natural materials? Is it even a problem?
Um,
Material is.
yeah, do you want to go, Tom?
No, I mean, well, yeah. So I mean, um, pests don't like eating through stone, but I would imagine you're thinking more like wood fiber. Interestingly, I mean, so vermin seem to go after the petro materials more than they do the natural materials. So I mean, they'll chew their way through wire, they'll chew their way through rubber and plastic. And the way to stop that is the same way you would stop them chewing through natural materials, is avoiding holes, is avoiding vermin access to areas. But certainly it's always a problem with all materials. And so there's a big one with wool recently, and moths. So there's a traditional borax treatment which apparently, you know, which works, but can you know, might need redoing if it gets kind of washed out. But there are treatments. But then the same again does apply for petro materials too. Ants love Celotex and will eat their way through it. And rats love Rockwool. There's a rubbish name for a band, but it alliterates. Yeah, so I mean, it is a case by case, but generally it's about doing your best to keep them away.
It's good detailing, isn't it?
Good detailing, yeah.
Okay. there's a couple of technical ones from Kevin Say. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but and these might be more of a ACAN WhatsApp group type of questions, quite technical. But there's one: how can you deal with fire safety regulation and building regs in a retrofit scenario? For instance, in evacuation stairwells, is there a good plasterboard alternative?
Oh, yes, there is. So lime is not flammable. So, and then we had this conversation the other day because also like gypsum, some of the people in our group are very pro gypsum, and it gets quite a bad rep, they believe. And I think there are definitely kind of, I mean, particularly on the continent in Europe, wood fibre is much more common than it is in this country, and I mean, their fire regulations are, I think, slightly less strict, if I'm being honest, but they have kind of equivalent certification. But there are, if you go on, for example, Back to Earth website, they have you can kind of, they have a specification generator, so you can put in what you're trying to achieve, and you can put in if it needs to be 60 minutes fire rated. I guess it depends if you're talking for surface spread of flame or fire resistance, because there are sort of different properties for each. But yeah, you can combine, for example, wood fibre and lime render to create a 60-minute wall. I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Laura, for posting that link.
Okay, so I think I'm going to call us to a close, because you might have suppers to go to, and anyway, but I really want to thank Steph and Tom for actually an enormous amount of work. We've been talking about this for a long time, and I know how much energy and effort and thought you've put into the presentation. So thanks so much for joining us. It's been really, really interesting. And we'll share the presentations with people who join the webinar. The webinar itself will go up on the Dorset Climate Action Network website with the other webinars. If anybody wants to follow up, you can email me. I'll just put my email into the chat. We did have a Dorset County Councillor on the call who really enjoyed it and is really keen on sustainable and affordable housing. So that's really positive. And who said that her father is a natural builder who's specialising now in using hyperlocal timber. So that's really encouraging. There's definitely a shift in Dorset over the last year, I think, with the council. So that's really positive. So yeah, so thank you everybody for joining. I hope that was useful, and thank you again, Steph and Tom, and see you all again soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.